Shut that door if we could, please. Ready? Late last week, the Republican leadership in the Minnesota House and Senate released their tax and budget targets, and the House tax proposal was billeted as and widely reported as a tax cut that would benefit lower and middle income Minnesotans. And one of the legislators said that, quote, we owe it to the working people to give them this tax cut. Well, as the analysis by the Minnesota Department of Revenue before you shows, that tax cut in taxable year 2012 would give hardworking Minnesota families earning between $20,000 and $30,000 a $12 a year tax cut. It would give Minnesota families between $30,000 and $50,000 in income a $26 tax cut. Minnesota families earning between $50,000 and $75,000 a year a $53 tax cut. And it would provide by far the largest tax cuts to the wealthiest Minnesota families earning over $250,000 a year. So once again, the Republicans just simply cannot help themselves at providing the richest Minnesotans with more benefits than they provide to middle-income families, working Minnesotans. Again, if you look at the Department of Revenue's analysis, a family earning over $250,000 a year would receive a tax cut in taxable year 2012 17 times greater than a family earning between $20,000 and $30,000 a year. They'd receive a tax cut that's 8 times greater than a family earning between $30,000 and $50,000 a year, and 4 times greater than a family earning between $50,000 and $75,000 a year. Put another way, families with incomes greater than $250,000 a year comprise about 3% of all the rate filers who would receive benefit from this tax cut, and they would get over 9%, or in other words, 3 times a greater percentage than their share of filers from the tax cut. You know, I don't know whether it's that the legislators don't understand what they're doing, or that they understand and are not being entirely candid with the people of Minnesota, and I don't know which one is worse. But to give a tax cut that provides a higher benefit to the wealthiest Minnesotans and then pretend it's a tax cut targeted to lower and middle income Minnesotans is simply not truthful, and that lack of candor is really destructive to the kind of public policy debate that we should be having here. Also, I sent a letter today to Speaker Zellers and to Majority Leader Koch regarding the budget targets that were in their Senate and House budget proposals last week, which, again, while those are broad numbers, would call for drastic cuts in funding for most state agencies. I've asked them, given the magnitude of those cuts, the severity of them, and the impact they would have on the ability of those agencies to provide services to the people of Minnesota, to agree to hold at least one hearing in each committee that would be making those decisions, to hear from the agencies themselves, each agency, about the effects of those proposed cuts, and then a subsequent hearing, a separate hearing, to hear from people in Minnesota who would be affected by those cuts on the services upon which they depend. We're talking about the ability, for example, of the Department of Natural Resources to keep state parks open. The DNR estimates that with a 20% budget reduction, they would have to mothball 7 state parks beginning this year, and would only be able to provide rustic camping at 14 other state parks. That would cost the state $300,000 a year in revenues. A 25% reduction in DNR's budget would require 15 state parks to be mothballed, in addition to the 14 which would be reduced to rustic camping services, and at a cost of $500,000 in revenue. Both the DNR and the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency estimate that the kind of 15 or 20% reduction in their agency budgets would delay this speed up of the permitting approvals that the legislature and I have agreed upon is essential to allowing businesses to proceed more swiftly. The Department of Agriculture estimates that the kind of budget reduction proposed for their agency would require them to eliminate state meat inspections, to eliminate the agriculture marketing services, to eliminate grants for dairy development, for livestock breeders, and for county fairs. Department of Administration estimates that the magnitude of cut being considered for their agency would require the elimination of the Environmental Quality Board staff, as well as elimination of the state demographer's link to the U.S. Census Bureau. Again, I think it's essential to make these decisions responsibly, that those hearings be held. There's time now before the end of the legislative session. Today actually marks the halfway point between my taking office today and the legislature yesterday and the scheduled May 23rd adjournment. So there's still time for these deliberations to occur carefully and responsibly, for those affected by them to be listened to by legislators before they make their final decisions. Be glad to respond to questions. Doug?
You've been fairly optimistic in public utterances now about compromise. Are you losing some of that optimism?
No, again, we're at the halfway point, and I presented my budget in detail. They presented their budget targets in broad scope, and now it'll be incumbent upon their respective committees to fill in the details. And that's where, again, this public participation in the deliberations becomes essential, because as they start to provide the detail about where they're going to make these very, very significant reductions in Health and Human Services and Agriculture, Department of Natural Resources, other areas, and the effects of those become known, it's very important that the public be listened to. So I think the process is continuing, and I remain optimistic that we'll find our necessary agreement by the constitutionally required adjournment date of May 23rd.
Governor, you're calling for additional hearings, but now Louis said that the cuts that you described today would be unacceptable to you. Are they unacceptable?
I think, again, the better way to approach this is to talk about what the consequences of those cuts would be. I think it's for the people of Minnesota to assess whether closing state parks and eliminating meat inspection services and others are cuts that they would find acceptable. And I think it's important that legislators understand the consequences of budget cuts of these severities before they make their decisions. And then we'll get into the final negotiation after the conference report has been passed by the legislature, and we both have a final proposal to put on the table.
On these cuts that you've mentioned, like the Ag Department, are you saying that meat inspection would go under a 15-point cut?
I'm saying I'm saying Commissioner Frederickson, I asked the different agency heads to write me letters that presented their information. We'll provide those letters. They're public information. So we'll provide those letters, and that's his assessment of what would be necessary at a 20% reduction in funding for his agency.
Again, is that his proposal, that would be cut, or is that just the equivalent of a 20% cut?
That's
in
what.
other words, is that going to go if you would have to?
Well, again, that's why the legislature needs to look at these in detail. I mean, the legislature specifies what services are being provided. As we got into this with the budget last bill that was passed, which I vetoed, where they were just telling the Commissioner of Management and Budget, you figure out where to make the cuts. I mean, these are not services that agencies just conjure up. These are services, programs that are specified in statute that are funded then by the legislature based on laws that the legislature has passed. So if the legislature wants to reduce for example, the Department of Agriculture's budget by 20%, then it's the responsibility of the legislature in this next stage of the process to specify what programs and services they want to see reduced or eliminated as a result of a 20% cut. But if it's not one, it's going to be something else. You can't just eliminate 20% or more of various state agency budgets and not have real consequences from doing so. And if they don't find one consequence acceptable, then they're going to need to point to another one that would they're willing to accept.
Governor, there's a bill introduced in the Senate today that would require public workers to pay more for their pensions and the state would pay less. There's another hearing today about that could impact the collective bargaining rights of teachers. Do you see these as kind of Wisconsin-style attacks on public workers in Minnesota?
Well, I think the proposal for the pensions would go far beyond what Wisconsin is proposing. And again, I think it's important the facts be known. I met last week with the executive directors of 3 state pension funds for teachers, for state employees, for local government employees. In total, given the present value of the funds, the employees have paid 12% of the costs. 13% was paid by the employers, and 75% of the value is the appreciation of those funds in the stock market. So, that's, wouldn't any pensioner be rightfully entitled to the gains from their investments in the stock market? That's what private pensions provide. That's the essence of a defined contribution plan in the private sector. You make an investment, and whatever is realized by the gains from that investment in the market or in bonds, whatever else the portfolio, those gains are to the benefit of the pension recipient. So I think it's important again that the facts be known. 12% of the value comes from employees, 13% from employer contributions. That's pretty even. And then 75% of the gain is the appreciation of the value of the market, which we hope will continue to improve.
And what about the teacher issue, collective bargaining rights?
Again, I mean, what we're talking about is collective bargaining rights. And I think collective bargaining rights are essential to, the rights of public employees and private sector employees. The changes in those rights or the results from those negotiations be negotiated, not stripped away by some outside authority. That's the essence of collective bargaining. So I would, I'm not ruling anything out at this point, and I'm not going to say, as some of others have, that my feet are on concrete on anything. But again, I believe one of the fundamental differences between Minnesota and what's been expressed so far versus Wisconsin is a respect for the fact that we have collective bargaining agreements, and those agreements need they're contracts, legal obligations of both parties, and they need to be honored. And the right to negotiate changes in those is something that both parties have, but should not be taken away unilaterally by some outside authority.
Republican in the House are going to consider a proposal tomorrow to cancel $60 million in previously appropriated bonding money, including $26 million for intercity passenger rail, money for an Olmsted County Public Safety Training Center. What do you think about that?
First I've heard of it. I'd have to look and see what the details are, talk to the Commissioner Sorrell and see whether those are bonds that are ready to be committed to projects. Obviously, if they're removed, those projects will not go forward. But again, without the details, I guess I can't comment further.
Governor, this week or next, it sounds like a Racino bill is going to be introduced in the legislature. Where do you currently stand on that, given the state's need for revenue as you see it?
Well, again, because of the need for revenue, I'm not going to rule out any legal, legitimate source of revenue. I made my own proposal previously about the only kind of gaming expansion that I personally would consider supporting, which is one state-owned operated casino at the Mall of America or downtown Minneapolis or somewhere where the benefits of it would derive entirely to the state and primarily to education. I'm not interested in expanding gaming for the benefit of private businesses. And so any expansions, for example, with the Racino at the 2 existing racetrack sites would, of necessity, I would accept, involve some profitability or they wouldn't be undertaken. But I want the most of the benefits from any such expansion to go, again, to the state of Minnesota, to the benefit of our school children. I'd have to look at the specifics of a proposal to see whether or not I could support it.
Would the Minnesota Vikings be considered a private business that you wouldn't want to benefit from that?
Well, I don't think, going put on my previous hat as an investor and as Commissioner of Economic Development, I don't think that gaming proceeds are a good source of assured revenue to pay off bonds. So I don't see that as a desirable or even an optimal source if you want the lowest interest rate for issuing public bonds to back it with gaming revenues. I think there needs to be a separate, different source of revenues to pay off the bonds on any People's Stadium. But I want the benefit from any expansion of gaming, if there is, to go to education.
So to be clear, on a Racino or expanded gambling, you would prefer that money not go to Viking Stadium?
I would prefer it not, first of all, because again, I want it to go to education and, hello?
Sorry.
Oh, I thought maybe you wanted me to. I was looking for the exit over there. No, so again, I think they should be kept separate. But again, I don't rule anything out. But if you talk to people I know in the past who issue bonds, they would tell me in the past that having an unreliable source in terms of the fluctuation of the revenues is undesirable. And if you want to issue bonds based on an unreliable source of funding, you're going to have to pay an unnecessarily higher rate of interest.
Governor, how does the situation in Japan influence the debate over the nuclear moratorium?
Well, first of all, no one would wish that kind of just horror on people, and so to talk about a public policy issue in Minnesota in the context of what's going on there is difficult to do. But I just know from what I read over the weekend, and sort of the established media sources, some questions have been raised, and I think it's another consideration. But I don't have all the facts. I don't think we know what the details are of what occurred there. But I just hope and pray that the consequences, the severity, are not in the nuclear power plants are able to be minimized.
Governor, can you react to the Republican House plan on LGA, cutting Minneapolis-St. Paul, removed from keeping the others at the current levels for the time being?
I think they're trying to split some cities from others, and I was impressed last week when I had the meeting with about 15 mayors from all over the state, cities in Minneapolis, St. Paul, as well as small cities in greater Minnesota. The smaller cities in greater Minnesota said, we're not going to support ourselves that kind of pitting of certain cities against others. To have the drastic reduction in property, in local government aid, and then put a freeze on property taxes is just a ridiculous gimmick. It's a way in which legislators, once again, are trying to micromanage the financial affairs of local governments, denying them a significant amount of resources, and then saying, well, you make even more drastic cuts now in local government services, but you're not even allowed to manage your own affairs. And once again, trying to distance themselves from the real consequences of cutting local government aids, which means that cities have no options other than to raise property taxes or make barbaric cuts in essential services, police and fire protection, and parks and libraries and street repairs, snow plowing. So it's just again making the financial affairs worse, and it's irresponsible financial management. And those who say they ought to run government more like a business should learn how successful businesses run their businesses, which is not to cause drastic hardship on operating subsidiaries and then tell them they can't responsibly manage their own affairs in the context of those kind of drastic cuts.
Governor, it's supposed to get warm this week. We're going to see some drastic melting. What kind of measures, have you gotten an update on the flooding, and what kind of measures are in place?
Well, tomorrow going to Mankato and Winona to have the 7th and 8th of these regional planning meetings. We're as prepared as we can be. I meet every time we're traveling with the Director of Emergency Services, Chris Eide, and now the Commissioner of Public Safety and the Adjutant General, the Guard. We're as ready as we can be, and had breakfast this morning with the Governor of North Dakota. We talked about the need for our two states to cooperate along the Red River. So, we hope and pray it'll be a melt and there'll be an absence of precipitation during March, such that the severity of the flooding will be reduced, but we're prepared for the very worst. And of course, if it is the very worst, it's going to have serious consequences. No one can prevent that kind of this serious consequence of major flooding from occurring, but I assured people in the areas most likely to be most severely affected, and I assure everybody in Minnesota that, first of all, I take personal and direct responsibility for managing the state's emergency response, and I will be omnipresent in those areas that are most severely affected, and we'll do everything we possibly can to be as responsive as we possibly can be to minimize the severity and the hardship on people, and I think we're as ready as we possibly can be.
I might follow up on that. What are you being told about the severity of it?
that, you know, the National Weather Service, as you know, deals with probabilities and percentages. And, you know, out in Montevideo last week, the National Weather Service told the people assembled there that it was virtual 100% certainty they would have a flooding greater than 2009, which was the second worst, and a 40% probability it would be greater than the worst it was historically in 2001. I read Paul Douglas over the weekend said, you know, that the next 2 weeks there's not expected to be a major storm, and that has a beneficial effect. I mean, so the three variables I understand is the amount of precipitation we have in the rest of March and then in April. Secondly, the degree at which it melts over time, and thirdly, how quickly the runoff fills into the various sites, and then how we can try to manage that as best possible.
When you started off by talking about the income tax component of the House proposal, how feasible do you think it is to propose any kind of tax cut on income tax this year?
Well, for every dollar of revenue you don't raise, you have to cut a dollar of spending, and those are, as we pointed out, some very draconian reductions in spending. If you cut taxes, I'd like to cut taxes. Everybody would, you know, benefit from a middle income and working families from a tax reduction. But you have to assess then what's the trade-off in terms of even more severe cuts in funding. And if you're cutting, you know, taxes for people making over $250,000 while pretending you're not, at the same time you're cutting local government aids, property taxes are going to go up for everybody. You reduce the renters' credit. Property tax payments are going to go up for renters, who tend to be lower middle income families. If you cut funding for higher education, tuitions go up for Minnesota students and for their families. So all of this becomes a trade-off. But, you know, once again, and it bothers me that the Republicans would present this as a tax cut targeted toward lower and middle income families, when the facts are the opposite, that the greatest benefit goes to upper income Minnesota families. And once again, they just have shown that their values, their priorities are to protect or benefit the richest Minnesotans at the expense of the rest of Minnesota. And I think that's the wrong priority. That's why my proposal, straightforward, it is what I say it is, and it would raise income taxes on the top 5% of Minnesota taxpayers, and it would protect the other 95% from paying a single dollar more in either income taxes or state-imposed property taxes. And I would challenge the legislature to match that kind of priority in its final deliberations.
Will you tell us a little more about what you and Governor Dalrymple talked about, and if you made concrete decisions on how to work together fighting inflation?
No, we just you know, he was in town for the weekend, and so we just agreed we'd get together and just work on building our relationship. And I paid off my bet on the loss of the UMD up a while back to the UND, and showing my faith in the Bulldogs, I renewed the bet if they play UND in the Final Five this weekend in St. Paul. No decisions made, just goodwill built.
Are you far apart from Republicans on the budget than you had expected back in January when you said no shutdown, no possibility of shutdown?
Well, again, I'm prepared to do what's necessary to conclude the session on May 23rd by finding common ground and meeting them in the middle of our respectively different proposals. But you know, it takes two to tango, and I read one senator last week saying he was going to bring his sleeping bag till Christmas. I mean, it takes willingness on their side to reach that middle ground as well. You know, if the analogy is that this is a football field and my proposal's in one end zone and theirs is in the other, well, then if we meet in the 50-yard line or thereabouts, then it's a given that both of us are going to have to move. I'm prepared to move. That's why I don't say my feet are set in concrete. But others say their feet are set in concrete in their end zone. I'm not walking from my end zone to their end zone, so it really even becomes for them to decide whether we're going to resolve this May 23rd. And we have to resolve it eventually anyway, so let's resolve it on May 23rd in an expeditious way that then allows everyone, agencies, and the recipients of the changes that are going to be made to be prepared for those on July 1st. And I mean, that's just the orderly, responsible way to do this. I remain committed to doing that.
So do you see the middle of the field rather than higher taxes and no tax increases as some tax increases?
Well, I mean, again, let's see. You know, I'm going to leave that undefined for now, and I'm not going to get into a debate on or discussion on the particulars until I know what their particulars are. I mean, all they've done so far is set very broad categories and put out some frankly misinformation about what the effects of their proposals, especially on the House tax side, are going to be. So let's have an honest, description at the end. We'll all know, I think, in detail about what their proposal is going to be. But until they produce a conference report passed by both the House and the Senate that sets their final tax and spending levels and compare it with mine, I'm not going to get involved in detailed negotiations because I'm just negotiating with myself.
So you're not going to get involved until after the conference?
Well, I'm involved. I'm certainly involved in discussions with them especially on legislative policy, and I'd like to have my agencies permitted the chance to get involved with them on my behalf and on behalf of the people of Minnesota whom they serve. That's the purpose of the letter I'm sending to the leadership today. But again, ultimately, it's their budget that they need to set, and we'll set their conference report, and then we'll have a final budget reflecting the legislative position, and I'll have my budget, and we'll get involved then in the detailed negotiations.
Are you less confident now than you were a month ago that May 23rd, that you can meet that deadline?
No, as I said, we're at the midpoint today, exactly 70 days, according to my math, from January 3rd to today, from today to May 23rd. So there's plenty of time for them to hold these hearings and allow public input. That's very important. And then we'll have time at the end to reach a resolution if they're willing to reach a resolution with me.
Governor, you talk a lot about the property tax and its relationships to LGA. If there are no cuts to LGA, can you guarantee to folks, homeowners, that they won't see any property tax increase?
I can guarantee there won't be any state-imposed property tax increases. If local governments were to increase their spending, then there would be a property tax increase. That's why, again, I increased the state funding for K-12 education, because then there won't be any state-imposed increase on the school part of property taxes. But again, if you look at the last decade, local governments have been very fiscally prudent overall in managing their affairs, as those mayors evidenced last week. They're cutting the budgets, they're cutting personnel, they're cutting spending. They've had to. I mean, the facts show that LGA and real after inflation dollars have been cut by 50% in the last decade, and half that's been made up by spending cuts, service cuts, and the other half by increased property taxes. So the local government officials have already, made a lot of those adjustments, and I don't see any of them going out. If the LGA is held to its current level, I don't see any of them going out and increasing spending.
Time for one more question.
Governor, you say you want your agencies involved in setting these budgets. Have Republican committee chairs denied them an opportunity to have input?
I'm not saying that because they haven't reached the point of the process. Until we had these targets last Friday, there really wasn't they talked about policy. No, and I would say with Commissioner Cassellius, I greatly appreciate that Senator Olson and Representative Garofalo allowed a good dialogue there. That's a textbook example of how to conduct this on the permitting bill. The agencies, MPCA and others were involved with the legislative leadership on the tax conformity, at least up to now. I appreciate that Tax Chair Davids was engaged with our Department of Revenue on those provisions. So they're good examples of where we have worked collaboratively together, where they have invited our participation, and where they have done so and we have done so. We've had successful resolutions, which, back to the earlier question, gives me hope we can do so on a continuing basis, and gives me hope that we can resolve our differences by May 23rd. So I'm not saying that they've been denied. I'm just saying at this point now that these targets are out, and now that these targets over the next couple of weeks or few weeks are going to need to be filled in with the details of how those targets are going to be met. Now is the time where I would request, and it is a request in the letter, that my agencies be permitted to testify about what the effects of these proposed cuts would be, and also that the people of Minnesota be listened to about what the effects would be. Thanks very much.